Good morning and welcome to Our Issues Milwaukee. I'm your host, Andrea Williams. Our focus this morning is on a charismatic speaker and leader who's considered one of the most acclaimed political, cultural, literary, and hip-hop voices of today. He is the author of 12 books, including his latest, The Education of Kevin Powell, A Boy's Journey into Manhood. Many may remember him from the first season of MTV's The Real World. He was a founding staff member of Vibe magazine and currently uses his voice to educate and analyze existing barriers in the political landscape and the human level. It's a pleasure to welcome to Our Issues, Kevin Powell. How are you?
Hey,
Thank you. A-Dub. He's given me a new name. I love it. I appreciate you being here. And you're actually in Milwaukee to be a keynote speaker at the Social Development Commission's Summit on Poverty.
Yes, ma'am.
And it has been proven that an epidemic of childhood poverty continues to haunt those who are living in this city, in particular, from generation to generation. So the goal of this summit is to not only examine the effects of poverty, but to hopefully come up with some solutions to break that cycle.
Yeah.
In this book, you talk about growing up poor in Jersey City and Brooklyn, New York, and the effects that poverty had on your life. So tell us more about The Education of Kevin Powell.
Well, I mean, for me, when I got the call from the folks here in Milwaukee about this summit, I immediately said yes, because I grew up in it. I was raised by a single mother who came from the South Carolina. She has an 8th grade education. She started working when she was 8, so her education was interrupted. And unfortunately, my father wasn't in my life. I saw him maybe 2 or 3 times until I was 8 years old, and he was gone. They were never married. And I literally grew up on welfare, food stamps, government cheese, and the kind of poverty I wouldn't wish on anyone. And it was horrific. You know, there's no other way to say it. I always say that poverty is a form of violence. And to this day, even though I've been blessed to publish, as you said, 12 books and travel the country and outside the country and do all kinds of things I couldn't even imagine when I was a youth, I still see the world through the eyes of working class people. I don't like terms like trailer trash, white trash, redneck, hood, ghetto, things like that. Anything that I feel disrespects people, no matter what their race or cultural background, who happen to be poor. And in Wisconsin, Milwaukee certainly has the same issues that we have back home in New York City where I live. And it has informed my life. You know, it's the reason why, part of the reason why I became a writer, you know, because I didn't have much else to do other than to read books and, you know, the books we borrowed from the library. And it's the reason why I became an activist, because when I started to realize, hey, this is a systemic problem, I need to get involved. And so this has been my life since I was 18 years old, both these things. And so it's important to me. And I'm just honored to be here and be a part of it. And so I want to talk about my own experiences growing up and how it affected me. You know, I don't think it's natural for a child to live in an environment where, you know, sometimes you have hot water, sometimes you don't. I don't think it's cool for a child or a mother to have to deal with rats and roaches, not mice, rats and roaches on a regular basis in their home environment, to move from place to place. I literally went to 4 grammar schools and 3 high schools. Part of it, I was an A student because my mother really pushed me hard. She tried to give me what she didn't have in her own life, but part of it was because we moved around a lot, you know. So poverty affects you in so many different ways, and it's especially, I think about it a lot now because we're about to approach the 50th anniversary of both Bobby Kennedy and Dr. King dying, and we know that Dr. King talked a lot in the last year of his life about the Poor People's Campaign, and Bobby Kennedy, a wealthy Irish brother, wealthy white American brother, organized a lot in the last couple of years of his life. He talked a lot about economic justice. So this is really what it's about. What are the opportunities? And Bobby Kennedy actually created something in Brooklyn that still stands to this day, back in the 60s, called the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation, which was an attempt to deal with systemic poverty in our communities. It was one of the first of its kind in the country. It's right down the street from where I live in Brooklyn.
Wow.
So I think about my own life. Education saved my life. Educational opportunities. I'm a huge sports fan. Sports provided me an outlet. You know, I played baseball, I ran track, you know, after school programs. I was able to go to college because of the civil rights movement, creating programs for people who didn't, you know, hadn't had an opportunity before. You know, I was a first-generation college student in New Jersey. It was called the Educational Opportunity Fund. It's a direct result of the civil rights movement. So when I see people attempting to cut out social programs for folks in these cities around the country, I'm like, do you realize you're helping to perpetuate poverty instead of helping people out of poverty?
Absolutely. So in reading your book, you have chapter 6 that's titled The Ghetto.
Yeah.
And you talk about growing up, not really realizing that you were in the ghetto, so to speak.
You were just there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you kind of get used to, you said, you know, you turn on the lights and there'd be roaches just running everywhere, and you could hear rats in the wall and things like that, which I think is traumatic.
It is traumatic.
But being that you hate those labels, what made you title that particular chapter
because
the ghetto?
It's a place, you know, it's a place, and we know that the word ghetto actually comes out of Europe, and it was a place that working class poor Europeans lived in, and it got carried over to this country. We can't forget that many of the immigrants, be they Irish, Italian, you know, other backgrounds, they were poor people, most of them. You know, I always tell people, go back and watch that movie Titanic. You had the rich folks at the top of the ship, but there were poor Europeans at the bottom of the ship, you know what I mean? And so poverty is a global reality, and it's stretched over centuries. And so
classism, all that stuff, it stretches across.
Absolutely.
Right.
So that's why, and I wanted to give people a really, you know, we've seen autobiographies, you know, Malcolm X's autobiography, Maya Angelou's autobiography, you know, but I was like, you know, I wanted to write something that really spoke to post-civil rights America, you know what I mean? Because I hadn't really seen a lot of books talking about it, and I said I'm just going to be very real and raw with it, you know?
Yeah. And that you are. There are a long list of statistics that's tied to poverty, and I think it's unfortunate that individuals are forced to deal with the effects every single day. We deal with the issues on this show, so we're talking about what's wrong, and many times are hoping that we can talk about what needs to be done. But it's sometimes overwhelming for me when I look at the fact that Milwaukee and Wisconsin as a whole have these placements in America. We've been named the worst state for Black Americans when it comes to unemployment and inequality in comparison to whites. Milwaukee's referred to as one of the most hyper-segregated cities in America. Wisconsin has the highest number of Black men incarcerated in the country. It's deemed one of the worst places to raise a Black child, and we're ranked number 2 behind Detroit when we're looking at cities that are impoverished. So that's just one hand, you know. All these things play a role when you look at some of the things that take place, and you do have to constantly ask, what do we do to fix this? What do you think when you hear that? Well,
I mean, I think a lot of things. You know, first of all, I feel that America, our country, still has not had an honest conversation about race and class. You know, that's the reality. This is, again, what I was saying earlier. Dr. King was attempting to have that conversation at the end of his life, because he was saying basically, what does it matter you can sit anywhere on the bus if you have no money to get on the bus? What does it matter you can sit at a lunch counter now if you have no money to buy a sandwich? And so, just because we got integration in this country where you can now move about in certain places, although that's debatable for some folks in some communities, you know, doesn't mean that we had full access to the American dream. And so, you know, and we also have to be honest about the fact that literally as soon as the ink dried on basic civil rights legislation in the 1960s, there were forces in this country, in New York State where I'm from, in New Jersey, in Wisconsin, that said, oh no, you know, no, we're not going to tolerate that kind of equality happening. And so you saw white flight out of communities like Milwaukee, you saw tax bases leaving, you saw infrastructures falling apart. You know, Milwaukee, Detroit, I mean, I've been to every state in this country, every major city in this country, it's the same thing everywhere. You know, and then what was left behind was an underclass that had to fend for themselves and try to figure out how do we make something out of this. I'm one of the lucky ones, to be really honest with you. When I think about where I come from and the people that I grew up with in Jersey City, which is no different than Milwaukee. You know, my mother was a one-person support system, and what we need, you know, instead of seeing it as this daunting kind of thing, like how do we come together as communities and make sure that there's a solution in place, not just dependent on the government or political forces. We should demand accountability from them, but what is it that we're actually going to do? My mother fought for me to get quality education. She fought crooked land persons who owned a lot of these tenements that we lived in for basic justice, for basic rights. And I think that, you know, we have got to become advocates for our own lives in a very different kind of way. And I believe that for Black America specifically, if I may say this, you know, any work that we do now, it has to be spiritual, political, cultural, financial, deal with physical health and mental health. In other words, it has to be a holistic, six-prong approach. That's what I feel based on my experiences growing up in this country, what I've gone through and what I've seen from city to city, where I've heard similar statistics over and over again. You know, and I also think, with all due respect to people, we have to point out, well, what are the victories there? What are the things that are actually working? What are the models that can be replicated? You know, because you're in Milwaukee. I know some great folks like yourself in Milwaukee, even though there's been a brain drain from Milwaukee because a lot of folks live in Atlanta, live in California, live in New York. But what can we do to the folks that are here? And we got to realize, if we did all, think about what we had during segregation, you know, where we were dealing with hostile racism, but we were building institutions. We got to get back to basic institution building for our communities. That's what I feel.
Take it back to square one,
yes,
basically.
Ma'am.
It makes sense to me. You've said that growing up in poverty without your dad at
Yes,
an early age made you angry, violent,
yes, ma'am.
sometimes a misogynist.
I would say most men are misogynists in this country.
You say most men are. That's interesting in itself. So when did you realize those things about yourself? Because sometimes, you know, people are things and they don't even realize it until something specific happens. When did you realize it?
Well, it wasn't until I engaged in destructive behavior as an adult, but let me take it a step back. I mean, let's look at how we're educated in this country. It doesn't matter if you go to public schools or private schools. You know, we are taught basically that everything that's been done great in this country has been done by men, you know, specifically white males. A few people of color here and there, but mostly white males, wealthy white males, the founding fathers, et cetera. And most of the definitions of manhood that we've gotten are based on violence, ego, aggression, conquering, discovering things, quote unquote, et cetera. That's called toxic manhood. You know what I mean? It leaves no room for you if you happen to be, what if you don't play sports? What if you don't like sports? You know, what if you happen to be a sensitive, emotionally expressive boy? Then you call all kinds of homophobic terms, which is what we do to each other. We police each other. You know what I mean? And then the girls come along. If you happen to be a heterosexual boy the way I was, well, we see y'all as one or two things, either sexual objects or caretakers. What can you do for me, basically? You know what I'm saying? And that behavior carries on into college. I speak at colleges, universities all the time. And I belong to a fraternity. I can't tell you how many fraternities I've sat down with, how many athletes I've sat down with who have engaged in destructive behavior towards the women and girls, women on those campuses. And so just like this country was founded on racism, which it was also founded on sexism. One of the football players, since I'm in the great state of Wisconsin, his brother plays for the Packers right now. Marcel is Bennett. His brother Michael there's a great interview where he's talking about sexism and how we define manhood and how he realizes his wake-up call was with his wife challenging him and having 3 daughters. And for me, it was engaging in toxic behavior and being challenged by women like, hey, Kev, how can you say you're about the community if you don't respect half the community, which is women and girls? You know, and going through college, as I say in the book, realizing here I am reading all these different books. I never read any women writers. Eve Ensler, Audre Lorde, Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni. Bell Hooks, who I love, who's a mentor of mine. Who's from your home state of Kentucky. That's right. Shout out to Kentucky. But you know, how can you define manhood if you don't even have an understanding of who created you, who gave you life, which is you all. And to me, we have to understand as men, no matter what our background, women are our equals, and we have no right to tell women what you all can do with your bodies. We should be challenging any society that says that, you know, you can do the same work as me, but you get less pay than I do. And no woman should feel like she can, if she goes out to just jog somewhere or walk somewhere, she'll get catcalled, or worse, she could get sexually assaulted or raped, you know, just because of who she is. And so, you know, for me and some other men that I work with, you know, it's about challenging these isms, and it can't just be racism, but it also has to be sexism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, you know, disrespect for people who are disabled. If we really believe in democracy in our country, then we should really believe that all people are equal and should be treated equally and fairly. That's what real democracy is. Wow,
and I love the fact that you are making your way around the country as well as internationally, preaching that message. It needs to be heard.
Well, I'm just an extension, ma'am, of my mama, who dealt with racism, sexism, classism her entire life. I'm just doing the work of Bobby Kennedy and Dr. King and Malcolm, my heroes, and Bell Hooks, my shero. You know, we have to have some courage because we live in a society, and I have to say this, you know, the hatred that we see out there right now, the division that we see out there right now, this is part of the work for us, you know, because we need leadership. If you're a leader, either you're going to be a bridge builder, which is bringing people together, or you're a bridge destroyer. You're constantly pitting people against each other. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, you know, I have more in common with working class white sisters and brothers here in Wisconsin than they have in common with Donald Trump, the president. But because of racism, they'll vote for Donald Trump because he's speaking a certain language to them, appealing to a sensibility that's been planted in them since they were children, literally,
wow.
and passed from generation to generation, thinking that they have privilege where he doesn't care about them either. You understand what I'm saying?
I do.
You know,
I do.
Poor people getting pitted against each other, you know, because of racism. And I'm saying, hey, wait a minute. You're talking about how you struggled. I talk about how I struggled. We were both trying to get some sort of opportunity here. Don't you understand we have something in common?
Yes, absolutely. And so I'm glad you brought up the whole political thing,
yes,
because you have run for political office in the past.
Congress, yes,
We're going to talk about that. Also, I want to talk about your very interesting place in hip-hop culture.
Yes, ma'am.
So if you'll stay right there, we will definitely talk about
yes,
that.
Yes, ma'am.
When we return to Our Issues Milwaukee, we will continue our conversation with Kevin Powell. We'll get his thoughts on politics, as I said, and discuss his place in hip-hop culture. We'll do that right after this.